Hey Westside, I'm here at historic City Hall in downtown Calgary. Over the last couple of weeks, we've been exploring the idea of faith in the suburban context. And today we're asking the question, what's the unique role of the faith community in response to the needs in the neighborhoods around us? So I thought, who better to ask than our city's fearless leader? Let's talk to Mayor Nenshi. Thank you, Mayor Nenshi, for being willing to speak to our community at Westside. We're in the middle of exploring a little of what it means to reach into some of the hidden needs in our neighborhoods and in our city, and for our community to be a part of the solution in reaching into those needs. So we're glad that you joined us, and we thank you for that.
Well, thank you. It's a great opportunity for me to spend a little bit of time virtually by video with your community. I actually spend a lot of my time talking to people of faith in different kinds of faith congregations across our city for a couple of reasons. Number one is because I believe that we as people of faith have so much more that unites us than that which divides us. And when we think about the values, the ethics, the tenets of what it is we do, there's enormous power in our common humanity. When we think about things like the dignity of every human being, when we think about the moral imperative for service, these things are all things that we have the ability to harness, and through that create tremendous power to make change within our communities. And I'm thrilled that you are spending time talking about this very issue, because one of the challenges we have in our city, one of the things that concerns me about our city is increasing stratification. Increasingly, people in their own neighborhoods, whether those are virtual neighborhoods like a faith community or physical neighborhoods, not mixing with different people in the community. You know, before I was mayor, when I was still a professor, I did a fair bit of research on this. And when I grew up in Calgary, in Marlborough, in Northeast Calgary, it was never a super wealthy neighborhood. There weren't a lot of doctors and lawyers living there, but there were a lot of people with cabins. There were a lot of people with boats. There was a lot of people who had small businesses, people who had been very successful in the trades and so on. And as a result, and right there, cheek by jowl, going to the same public schools as Vietnamese boat people who had just arrived in Canada. And that kind of mixing to me is tremendously important. And one of the things we're starting to see in Calgary is this stratification where you have communities that are more affluent, communities that are less affluent, that continue in that way generationally. And that's challenging for two reasons. The first is because you don't have that mixing. And a city, by definition, means people from different backgrounds come together. But the second problem is that for those who live in more affluent communities, we tend to think that social concerns in our community, concerns around poverty, around housing, and so on, are issues for somewhere else, are issues for another neighborhood. And in fact, the literature proves that that is just not the case. You know, the public school in Mount Royal in Calgary has some of the biggest social needs of any school in the city, because it not only serves the community of Mount Royal, it also serves a lot of people who have just arrived in Canada, often from terrible refugee situations. You know, on West Calgary, which we tend to think of as more affluent, there's lots of poverty there. There's poverty among new Canadians. There's poverty among senior citizens. There is certainly poverty among people who are perhaps house rich, but cash poor. And all of these things are things that are happening in our very communities, and it's important for us to be aware of that.
That's great. Well, you've touched on some really key things already. Now, in your role and your vision for the city of Calgary, do you have a place for a unique role that the faith community can play in this collaborative effort of working for the good of our city in our neighborhoods?
I believe that there needs to be a place for faith in the public square. In fact, I got myself in a bit of trouble in the last couple of weeks because we had this Supreme Court ruling about prayer at city council meetings. And it's a very narrow ruling. It's just about religious neutrality at public meetings of municipal government bodies. It's that narrow. But it concerned me because although I'm not a lawyer or a judge, I was concerned that the court was not drawing a distinction between religious neutrality and the need for public bodies to treat all faiths without elevating any above the other, with the issue of secularism, which to me says there is no place for faith in the public square. And I love the fact that there is a creche, there's a nativity scene outside of City Council at Christmas time, right smack up next to the community menorah. I love the fact that every year we have an event called Eid at City Hall, where Muslims, Christians, and Jews come together to talk about Abraham and the message of Abraham and the Abrahamic tradition. To me, this stuff is really important because as we have a community which is inclusive, which draws people of many faiths and those without faith, that we don't say that one element of your identity is less important and you cannot bring it with you when you come to the public square. People don't ask me to leave my ethnicity behind when I come to the public square, so why should I then leave my faith behind? The key, though, is to do that in a way that is inclusive, that gathers people together. And I'm very naive about this. I think that's actually not hard to do, and that we need to be able to do that. But part of that, I think, means that communities of faith should and do and can use their voice in order to speak out. So for example, when we talk about poverty in our community, faith communities have traditionally been extremely engaged in the fight against poverty. Everything from running soup kitchens to starting missions to, housing homeless people. In From the Cold, of course, started, and the reason it's called In From the Cold, is a place for bringing homeless families into church basements. And I've often said that all good social movements started in a church basement somewhere. But I think that as the issues become more sophisticated, as issues around poverty and homelessness become more challenging, we've seen faith communities in some ways step back a little bit, saying, these are issues for experts to deal with. These are issues for the system to deal with. But in reality, these are issues for human beings to deal with, for each of us as people to manage. So under the Calgary Poverty Reduction Strategy, for example, the real basic element of that strategy is that simple truth that we believe here in our community, which is not a truth that is universally held in this broken world of ours, and that's just that we're all in it together. The Calgary Poverty Reduction Strategy is called Enough for All, and there's a double meaning there. It means that there's probably enough money going into poverty-serving organizations to do a better job, but what it really means is that in a community of abundance, in a community of prosperity, there ought to be enough for everyone. And so it's our job to figure out what that means. And I think that communities of faith have a big job to do there. So for example, one of the elements of the Calgary Poverty Reduction Strategy is the creation of what we call community hubs. And these are physical places where people who are experiencing poverty or other problems in their life can go and be referred to services, be assisted then and there. And for me, there's no reason why churches can't become community hubs in our neighborhood, open to all, but being there as a space for people to find refuge, physical, mental, spiritual, in the community. So I think faith communities have a huge role to play. I'll give you another example. I dwell, as many human beings do, too much on my failures. And one of my failures, my biggest policy failure since I have been mayor, is that I have been unable to get council to move significantly on the issue of secondary suites in our community. And I actually have what I call a moral argument on why this is important to do, which is that we have in our city today, in every neighborhood, in Aspen and Springbank, as well as in Forest Lawn and Dover, we have illegal suites where people are living. And those might be temporary foreign workers, they might be nannies, they might be students, they might be seniors, but they're in every single neighborhood. And the vast majority of these are illegal. And what that means is that when those tenants, the vast majority of landlords are very, very good, the vast, vast majority. But when you get a landlord that isn't good, and you have a situation where the tenant is being abused by the landlord, if you have a situation where there's mice or there's mold or the smoke detectors aren't working, well, those people, our neighbors, have no recourse. They can't do anything. They can't come to the city and say, I've got a problem, because the city will kick them out of their house. So we have said, and by the way, we're never going to enforce all of these illegal suites and kick all these people out. You know, we are so proud of ourselves when we are able to build 100 units of affordable housing a year or 200 units a year. And for us to get rid of 30,000 units, it's impossible to imagine. So we've all turned a blind eye. And we said, you know what, it's okay that these people, our neighbors, live without the protection of the law that the rest of us enjoy. I don't think that's right. And the reason I bring that up is because I think faith communities have a real role to play here, and many of them have. The strongest advocate for safe, legal secondary suites is the Catholic bishop. But I think that every one of us in faith communities need to use those morals and ethics and say, you know what, these drive me to speak in the public square about what's right. And there are ways to do that. If faith communities come together as one and say to our city council, to the community, we got to do what's right by other people. And that's an important part of who we are as Calgarians. And the power that is unleashed in coming forth and doing that, I think, cannot be matched. And I think it's a role we ought to play and that we should play.
How do you envisage that faith communities across Calgary can begin to identify the needs in their neighborhoods, whether it's as a community around which the church is built or any other faith community is built, or whether it's just where the individual members live?
In some ways, this is an easy thing to do because churches, temples, synagogues have always been places of gathering where different kinds of people come together. I'm going to go off on a tangent for a minute. I never do that, but I will do that for a moment. I was actually recently at a groundbreaking for a particular faith community, and private donors had given money for a new building. This is not an uncommon thing, thankfully, in faith communities. And I was looking at the renderings while the endless speeches were going on. And I was looking at how beautiful this building would be. And I got really struck for a moment. And what struck me was, you know what? This is a place that is open to the members of that faith community. So you might have a newly arrived refugee from northern Kenya who has known nothing but the squalor and degradation of refugee camps. And you might have the mayor. And both are entering this room, this beautiful, dignified place together. And both are sitting there together in worship. And to me, the fact that we say to everyone in the community, you deserve this space. You deserve this beauty and this dignity, and you deserve the ability to reflect your faith in one place is a tremendously powerful thing. And it's something that we should continue to support. So to answer your question, it starts by looking within our own congregations and making sure that no one in our congregations ever feels alone, that no one in our congregation ever feels that they do not exist in a place where if they stumble, someone will be there to catch them, where an entire community exists to help them stay on their feet and help them and their families succeed. I think most faith communities do a great job of that within their congregation. So how do we take that same sense, that same feeling, and apply it to all of our neighbors across the community? It's not hard to find these social issues. It's not hard to find them. What's hard is to recognize them and to open our hearts to them and to make sure that we know that they're there. So, the largest food bank drive every year in Calgary is not the mayor's food bank drive. I wish it were. That's the second largest. The largest, actually it might be the third largest, but the largest one is one that's done on one day every year by members of a particular faith community, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And every single family goes out in their neighborhood and collects money for the food bank. And it's a marvelous thing when you see these little kids coming with these food bank donations to the central repository, and you know that those children are being educated in what is a lifetime of service, and that only happens because they belong to a faith community. And so I think that faith communities can be less shy. We can get out into the community much more and not be scared that we are trotting on secularism or we don't know our place, but in fact say, you know what, we are guided by what we know. I reflect sometimes on that verse from Romans, right, that says, owe no man any debt except the debt we all have to love each other. And it's okay to talk about that. And it's okay to say that this is the stuff that guides us in terms of social justice, in terms of working to make our communities better.
Maybe you can just speak, you've touched on it, but speak a little more and extrapolate on, the way that faith communities historically have, or more recently at least, have tried to kind of replicate social services and have actually, in some ways, perhaps moved away from what might be a more unique role that they can play in alignment with what the city's doing, what social services are doing, what other organizations are doing?
When I was first elected mayor, I started something that we now call the Calgary Poverty Reduction Strategy. And I set together a bunch of people, some from faith communities, some from social service agencies, some from the community at large, and just said, figure this out. What are the big ideas for how we deal with poverty in our community? Because even in a rich place like this, there is extraordinary need. We have the most income inequity in Calgary of anywhere in Canada, and it's getting larger. And I asked them to come up with big ideas. And they really didn't come up with new ideas, but they did come up with big ones. But the biggest one was this idea that we can collaborate, that we don't need to duplicate services, we don't need to recreate within a faith community what exists in social service agencies, but together we can fill in the gaps and we can fill in the holes. So I really encourage faith communities to think of themselves as that community hub. How do you invite in the Boys and Girls Club? How do you invite in the the Calgary Bridge Foundation for Youth that works with new Canadian youth? How do you invite in my colleagues in the Calgary Police Service who do extraordinary work helping to catch children at risk, but they can't be there 24 hours a day? And so one great role that the faith community, the church, if you like, can play is that role of convener. Because it may well be that those agencies aren't even talking to one another. And to bring people into that proverbial literal church basement to talk about what you can do in the communities that you serve, I think is a very powerful tool.
With increasing population and urbanization, how can we help to preserve the small town heart that people love still so much about Calgary?
I'm an urbanist, and I spend a lot of my time thinking about how cities can work better. That's how I ended up in this job. But one of the really interesting things about this is all the things we seek in a city that works well. In the physical structure of the city, we want the ability to walk to the store. We want the ability for the kids to walk to school. We want to make sure that we can live our lives in our neighborhoods and our communities as much as possible. What we're really trying to do is recreate small towns in the context of a big city. And I think that even where that's not physically possible, when you have a very, very large congregation out on the west end of the city and you're drawing people from across the whole city, it may feel a little bit like I've got this community here on Sundays, and then I go back to my geographic community where maybe I'm involved with the community association, maybe my kids play soccer, but I'm part of all of these different things. And I believe part of the answer to that is to embrace it all and to live in community and to breathe the same air as our neighbors as much as possible in order to better understand our neighbors. Some urban theorists say that front drive garages are terrible for neighborhood life because people just drive into their garage and there's no front lawns to hang out on and you just see the driveways. I kind of disagree because I live in one of these houses, and one of the places where I often get to meet my neighbors is we're all shoveling the driveways at the same time, and it's an opportunity to talk about the miserable weather. But these sorts of things actually make a difference. And making those human connections, I think, is really important. And once again, the faith communities can act as a catalyst for that. If people are coming to a service and leaving as individuals, atomized, then I would suggest that we can do a better job of ensuring that that time when they're breathing the same air as the co-congregants is an opportunity for them to really feel as though they're part of something else. And getting people to use that thinking and translate into action is the key. I often say that our community is not made by politicians or by CEOs or by people who run nonprofit agencies or even by pastors. Our community is made by everyday people using their everyday hands and their everyday voices to make extraordinary change. And I really believe that. I believe every one of us has that power in our hands, our hearts, our souls, and our minds to be able to make the community better, whether it's shoveling your friend's walk or taking a leadership role at your church or starting a new nonprofit organization or advocating at your public school for the kids whose parents are working shifts and cannot advocate for themselves. These are all ways in which we use our hands, our hearts, our minds, and yes, our souls to make our community better. And to me, That's part of the price we pay for living. We are so lucky to live in this place where everybody has opportunity, where everybody, regardless of where they came from or what they look like or how they worship, or if they don't, has the opportunity right here, right now, to live a great Canadian life. But that doesn't come without a fight. And it doesn't come without those of us who are blessed with resources, whether they're physical, financial, intellectual, or spiritual, to use those resources to ensure that those who don't have the resources also have the opportunity.
Hey, Nenshi, that's brilliant. Thanks so much for sharing your heart
Thank
with
you.
our community.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.